You are listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. I'm Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the programme, and do visit our website for all your coronavirus updates, theafricareport.com. I hope you and yours are healthy and safe. My guest today is Abebe Selassie, the director of the International Monetary Fund's Africa Department. He spoke to me during the institution's virtual spring meetings, a video conference marathon for which he recommends selecting a comfortable chair. The IMF have been having what you might call a good crisis, swiftly offering debt relief to 19 African countries, with others, including Ghana and Tunisia, accessing their rapidly dispersing facility. It has also pledged $18 billion to the continent from its own funds and helped to mobilise official creditors to the tune of $57 billion in loans and grants for Africa in 2020. Abebe Selassie believes that the recent agreement with G20 countries will help in two ways.
Prompted by the call that Kristalina and David Malpass made a few weeks ago, the G20 group of countries have endorsed significant bilateral official sector relief to IDA-eligible countries, which will be really very beneficial for quite a large number of countries. I would highlight two things about this. I think first is it's not just the Paris Club, but the G20. So it includes, of course, other important creditors to the region, the Gulf countries, China, and a number of other countries. So it's a broader group of countries than just those in the Paris Club. So that's very good. Second, again, heeding this initiative that was underway, even the private sector has come forward, noting that countries may need debt relief, and should they ask it, the private sector should participate in this. So again, this is very beneficial. What effect will this have? Basically, it will give countries additional fiscal space. Countries are seeing a big collapse in revenues. Their spending needs going up to combat this health crisis. So the room that the resources that they would have used to amortize debt or pay interest will now instead go towards supporting populations. So that would be beneficial. But I want to stress that by far the most important support, of course, the international community, institutions like the IMF are offering, of course, is the new financing that we are providing, which will have a significant impact.
I mean, how does this stack up in terms of the division between privately held debt, which has grown significantly in the last few years, and the debt owed to multilaterals, to G20 countries? What's just the rough proportions? Is it 50-50 now, private and the rest?
It depends country to country, really, and it varies quite a bit. But in aggregate, private, non-multilateral, non-official debt is close to around half, I would say, of total debt obligations. So there is what another frame to think about it at this time, if you will, is that the international financial institutions are counter-cyclical organizations, particularly entities like the fund, of course. So we go in when others are not lending to countries, right? The same, the bank also will have the opportunity to extend a lot more credit at a time like this. I mean, because countries' ability to borrow from capital markets is going to be curtailed with the dislocation that we're seeing in capital markets. So, we are stepping up and providing a lot more resources at this time. IMF's, the share of IMF debt in the region from the total is really very, very small, very small. Again, a couple of countries where it approaches maybe in the high single digits, but for the vast majority of countries, we are, I don't know, 3-4% of their total debt, I would say. Now, though, of course, with access to international capital markets disrupted, with the strains that bilateral creditors are facing and may not be able to be extending loans, we will be stepping up and trying to provide a lot of new financing.
Will you be tacking on any riders to new financing or to debt relief? Will there be demands, for example, that I don't know, that Nigeria gets rid of fuel subsidies and these kinds of things?
No, so I mean several things. I mean, in the normal course of our engagement, for those countries that seek IMF financing, what will countries tend to ask because they are having difficulties tapping capital markets, or borrowing domestically because deficits have gotten out of hand, and that's when we step in to provide support. And what we do is we agree on a 3-4 year program during the course of which countries take steps to address the imbalances that cause them to come to us, and they can revert back to their normal long-term sources of financing. This is a crisis which is prompting a synchronous global downturn, huge dislocation in capital markets, and it's not a crisis of policy-induced crisis domestically, but rather a health catastrophe and downturn globally, which is impacting countries. So in a crisis like this, the IMF acts a little bit how central bank would act as a lender of last resort when domestic financial markets are disrupted. So the window that a lot of the countries are coming to is this rapidly dispersing, the windows where we have rapidly dispersing resources. So in these windows, what we ask countries to do is basically that they're using the resources to do what is needed at a time like this. Increase health spending, support populations. The latter aspect in Africa in particular is really, really important. Given that we don't have traditional social safety nets, unemployment insurance schemes, in a crisis where you're asking people to stay home, to sacrifice their livelihoods, it really is important, of course, that governments provide support to the population. So that's the kind of commitment that we seek from countries as we're dispersing these resources very quickly in a period of 3-4 weeks.
Is it fair to say that there's been a mini conceptual revolution at the IMF in the way it looks at inequality, and that actually inequality is a real threat to growth? I'm talking about a book that called Confronting Inequality that Ostry, Rungani, and Berg of the IMF put out recently. How does that fit into thinking about healthcare in Africa, which very often is incredibly unequally distributed? You have privatized systems to cater to the very thin slice of the population who can afford it, and then a mixture of sort of ad hoc systems, and very little in the way of big public systems that can actually meet the demands of 1 billion people.
I think that's a very good question. I guess in the past we've felt kind of, the focus of economic policy, our discussion should be on as high a growth as possible, and what macroeconomic stability can do to foster very high growth. And I guess there was an expectation that this high growth would reach many parts of the population. but what we saw, of course, starting, around the late 2000s, is that notwithstanding significant growth elsewhere around the world, but also in many African countries, inequality is not declining as much. Now, in the advanced countries and a lot of emerging markets integrated into the global economy, including some in our region, you also had the really, adverse effects that the global financial crisis had in terms of inequality outcomes. I mean, South Africa is a good example. How unemployment shot up and never really came down post the global financial crisis to a significant degree. So one thing we're trying to do in the face of this, really calamitous hit to the global economy is to make sure that, what interventions we're doing now from the word go, will be supportive of, reducing inequality. So that's something we definitely are thinking about. Frankly, also, it's a no-brainer, right? At a time like this, the kind of crisis that we're facing, that you have to think about how to support people. What has made our work very complicated. Kristalina has been saying, how much we're having to talk to epidemiologists, the WHO, and the like. This is a health crisis first and foremost, with massive bearing on economic well-being. If you don't solve the health part, you're not going to get economies back, thriving as they need to be. So. And some of the measures that you have to take are really detrimental to economic well-being. As I noted earlier, you're asking people to stay home. You're requiring them to stay home. Of course, you then have to find a way to compensate them for requiring them to stay home. The burden has to be shared by everybody. I mean, this is, again, a disease that doesn't respect rich or poor. This is a disease that, doesn't respect within a country or across borders. Hence also why it's so imperative that, poorer countries who have less access to financing, as is the case in many in our region, need really, really stepped up international support.
Just taking, for example, the way that the healthcare system in Ethiopia progressed over the last couple of decades, and the former health minister of Ethiopia is now running the WHO, as you know. So there is some kind of symmetry here. It does seem that, I believe it was in an IMF report about a decade ago, that it praised Ethiopia for doing exactly what we were talking about, this idea of shared growth, not just growth fueled perhaps by commodity sales, but genuinely shared growth, so that individuals across society can benefit. And this, I think, I remember looking at surprise at this report, because it's not often that the IMF will point to a country doing relatively unorthodox things in terms of the general economic canon, and yet here was the IMF saying these are interesting and impressive things. So my question to you is, what are the institutions that African countries should lean on if it wants to promote more shared wealth coming out of this crisis?
I think, first, I mean, kind of how we try, it's very difficult to generalize one cross-cutting policy approach, right? So in the countries where you have strong state capacity, of course, there's going to be much more scope for a government to do a lot of things in terms of the provision of health, good services. So that's one approach that you may need to take. In other cases, maybe you need to rely and find ways to incentivize these services to be provided by the private sector. I would say kind of, the most important thing in terms of government policy levers that you have at the macro level is really ensuring that you invest in